So our first presenter, Dr. Sarah Eaton from the Workland School of Education at the University of Calgary. Sarah is an associate professor of education at the University of Calgary. She holds a concurrent appointment as an honorary associate professor with Deakin Learning Futures at Deakin University in Australia. She served as the inaugural educational leader in residence academic integrity at Taylor Institute for Teaching and Learning at University of Calgary, and has served as the chair, leadership policy and governance specialization area. Dr. Eaton's research focuses on academic ethics in higher education. Her work can be found in the Canadian Journal of Higher Education, the British Educational Research Journal, Educational Policy, and the Journal of Academic Ethics, among other places. She is the editor-in-chief of the International Journal for Educational Integrity through Springer Nature, a Q1 education journal published by BMC Springer. Dr. Eaton is the co-founder and co-editor of Canadian Perspectives on Academic Integrity. She's an internationally recognized authority in the field of academic ethics. In 2020, she received the National Research and Scholarship Award from the Canadian Society for the Study of Higher Education for her contributions to research on academic integrity in Canadian higher education. In 2022, she received the Outstanding Researcher Award from the European Network for Academic Integrity. And Dr. Eaton's presentation for today is titled Looking Forward, Academic Integrity in the Age of Artificial Intelligence and Post-Plagiarism. Welcome, Sarah. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation, Rob, to join you, as well as the kind introduction. It's so great to be here with all of you today. Maybe I'll just take a moment to bring up my slides. Just wanted to confirm you can see those okay.
That we can.
Terrific, wonderful. So today, I just wanted to start with a bit of a land acknowledgement. I'm joining you today from Treaty 7 territory from my home in Calgary, Alberta, which is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. And I've included here a photograph of Peyto Lake in Alberta, which some of you may have been to before. It's in the beautiful Canadian Rocky Mountains. I just wanted to take a moment to recognize the ancestral and traditional caregivers of the territory upon which we live. And for me, recognizing these caregivers as well as the land is part of my ethical commitment to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls for action. And so I just kind of wanted to situate there and let you know where I'm joining from today. Of course, I'm not overlooking that beautiful lake. However, I thought it was a gorgeous photo to share with you all today. Just to kind of set the stage today, I wanted to let you know that I've shared with Rob and the organizers a copy of the slide deck, and they have my permission to share it out with all of you after the session today. If in the meantime, we were just talking about social media before the session started today, if you want to, you have my permission to take screenshots of any of the slides, share them on social platforms that you're on. If you want, you can tag me. I would be happy if you did that. But in other words, my presentation is shareable and you can use it as you like. In our time together today, we will focus on academic integrity, do a little bit of an overview around that. Of course, artificial intelligence is on everybody's mind. And I will frame this by saying I am not an expert in artificial intelligence. I do not have a computer science background. My background is in education, policy, and leadership and governance. And through some of that work, ended up doing some research on academic integrity, but I like to be really clear up front about what the limitations of my work are in this regard. So I can't answer questions, for example, about technical aspects of artificial intelligence, but I can tell you what we're working on from a pedagogical perspective and also an ethics and academic integrity perspective. Some of which is framing conversations around post-plagiarism and what does that mean? What might it mean for us going forward, and how do we support our students with writing in the age of artificial intelligence? And then what does this mean for us as educators going forward? You will see during the session today that I have two screens going. So if you see me looking over in this direction, that's where my slides are on the screen. I also wanted to frame the conversation today around a framework that will be coming out. It's not out yet, it should be soon, in the Handbook of Academic Integrity in the second edition. The first edition of this book was led by Tracy Bretag, who was an internationally recognized expert in our field. And I have the privilege of editing the second edition, which has 112 chapters in it, and topics that have historically been neglected with regards to academic integrity, such as equity, diversity, inclusion, accessibility, decolonization, indigenization. And we have authors from all over the world. There are a couple of authors that'll, if you just heard that noise, that's the timed cat feeder. The cat will be coming in to get his lunch soon. We also have a couple of chapters coming forward on artificial integrity and artificial integrity. That was a Freudian slip, artificial intelligence. And the authors who've contributed that were tried to be mindful when they wrote the chapter that these handbooks are updated every 3 to 5 years, right? None of us have a crystal ball, but to be able to kind of frame the conversation around ethics in a way that people could go forward with it. As those chapters were coming in, and I was reading them all as they were coming in, various drafts along the way, tried to find a through line for it. And what came through for me in these 112 chapters, 109 of which are new, by the way. Often new second editions are just a rehash of the old one. We kept three chapters from the first edition, and everything else would be brand new. But the through line that came for me was really, a need to disrupt historical ideas around academic integrity that really are just about student conduct and exacerbate adversarial and antagonistic relationships with students that pit students against teachers or teachers against the administration or students against the administration, but rather looking at it more holistically and thinking about what are the responsibilities of students. So by no means do students relinquish their responsibility to act ethically, but at the same time, considering other concepts such as instructional leadership. And certainly during the pandemic, that came up more when we saw things such as what came to be known in my area anyway as honeypot answers of teachers posting fake answers on file sharing sites to try and catch students in the act, a form of entrapment, if you will. And so, things like what does it mean to assess students fairly, not only just fairly in terms of the course content, but also in terms of instructional ethics and what we would normally be considered an unethical behavior, so entrapment, for example, but also kind of pushing those boundaries. Like in this day and age, is it a form of a breach of integrity if teachers don't update their assessments, or they keep recycling their assessments for 10 or 15 or 20 years? And also understanding that today's students are not the same students of the 1950s and 60s who come to class and studying is their only responsibility, that now those students are probably in the minority, and students have infinitely more complex lives with their jobs, their family caregiving responsibilities, other responsibilities that they may have, and even their role as students is changing with things like an increasing emphasis on publication for graduate students, and many universities around the world now have an increased emphasis of undergraduate research experience. So things like including research integrity and ethics and publication ethics as part of that, knowing that the lines between students and researchers may be more blurred than it ever has before. So this is kind of a more comprehensive framework, hasn't been operationalized yet in any way, but really just wanting to situate this work as about more than student conduct. And if there's one key takeaway today, it would be that. But some of today's talk will be focused around artificial intelligence and some of the changes that we have. And for me, that started back in 2021. I was writing this book on plagiarism in higher education. It was due to the publisher in May of 21. So we were still sort of in the thick of the pandemic, if you will. And the book starts with a bit of a history of plagiarism. Then we go through plagiarism today, and it ends with looking towards the future. And I was madly rewriting the last chapter just days before the manuscript went into the publisher, because I could tell that artificial intelligence was on the horizon, and we were already getting signals then that it was going to become more and more important. So I'll kind of circle back to this book a little bit later in the session today, but just kind of wanted to let you know how my interest in this started. So I have a background in languages and literatures. That's where my first 2 degrees were before I went to education. So I came to this looking at text, plagiarism, plagiarism of text, plagiarism of ideas, other kinds of plagiarism, computer code, musical compositions, artistic plagiarism, and so forth. And so that's kind of the world that I come from when I come to this artificial intelligence work. And so that was May of 2021. Fast forward 6 months, and we have grant applications due at the University of Calgary for institutional level teaching and learning grants. They invite us to submit a draft. We can get some feedback on a draft and then submit the final application. So in October of 2021, put it forward a grant application for some draft feedback. And the feedback we got on this title, Artificial Intelligence and Academic Integrity, was, come on now, isn't that a little bit Star Trek? Do you really think artificial intelligence is going to have any place in education? And we sort of said, yeah, we do. But we actually had a hard time convincing our internal, what do they call it? Like College of Adjudicators, College of Reviewers, that this was going to be a thing. So we bolstered our lit review and we tried to make our case a little bit better that, yeah, we really thought that this was something worth pursuing. So we put in our grant application, the final version, in January of 22. In April of 22, we got our grant. Yay, before ChatGPT blew up. I can say, framing this work, this is the only time in my entire research career that the instrument we were using was outdated before we even administered it. But be that as it may, the initial pushback that we got to this project was that this had nothing to do. This was too far-fetched. This was like Star Trek. So it was interesting for us being in that space at the time. Our university has a fairly strong emphasis on what they call transdisciplinarity, meaning focus on wicked problems that can't be solved by any one individual alone, boundary spanning work. And so as a result, when I was putting together our research team, and we do have folks from the School of Education, and I reached out to a colleague in engineering, mechanical engineer. His area of specialization is agent-based modeling, had done some previous agent-based modeling on academic integrity, and we collaborated a bit on that work, and then invited a colleague from the Faculty of Arts, specifically the Department of English, with some experience in creative writing, and then also a member of our professional staff, Student Accessibility Services. And so we brought this team together. And when we came together, we had very different positions. So I was looking at this from the ethical perspective. Our engineering colleague, Bob, thought this was the greatest thing since sliced bread. Bring it on. Our colleague from English pretty much thought it was heinous and should be banned. And then our colleague from Student Accessibility Services, who's a disability advocate, said, well, if this is assistive or adaptive technology, could we be violating students' human rights if we try to deny them access? So we had these really different starting points. And I can say over the life of the project, we've become more homogeneous as we've sat down and listened to each other. And one of the great things about this project was we really did start by listening to each other, because it was like we really came from different planets. It's been wonderful to work with these folks from different areas of the university, different disciplines. So the beginnings of this project, like, we really started with some questions considering algorithmic writing technologies and the related ethical complexities. So the lane, that you will, that we're staying in is text-based artificial intelligence tools, large language models. And we really had an interest in developing evidence-based recommendations. So in my field around academic integrity, everybody has an opinion. Many people have experience, and then their opinions are formed on their experience and not necessarily on the evidence that's available in the research literature. We wanted to get ahead of things by having some available evidence to help inform policy decisions about AI text generating policies. This was all before ChatGPT came on the scene, but nevertheless, that was our starting point. And we wanted to look at academic integrity through a teaching and learning perspective. So we were not interested in catching students. The gotcha approach to academic misconduct is not part of our ethos. We wanted to look at the implications for pedagogy and practice as well as assessment. When we came to this work, we noted that there was some fairly big gaps in the scholarship, many of which are being filled quickly. There's a lot more literature on AI apps now than there was even 6 months ago. So now we're trying to sort through the quality of that literature. And what we came to look at, in the beginning, was that there weren't that many articles, evidence-based articles about addressing artificial intelligence tools' ethical and pedagogical implications together. We wanted to look at that. We didn't just want to look at pedagogy as a how-to, here's how you use this tool, without considerations of some of the ethics behind it. We were really interested in those two things together. And then we wanted to look at the research relating to differentiating human and artificial capabilities. And we're informed heavily by Margaret Behrman's work, together with Lucan and some of her other work out of Deakin University. And we also are relying a lot on Phil Dawson's work, looking at the lack of clarity and differentiating students seeking to cheat from those trying to find assistance. And Dawson talks a lot about this in his work on student feedback and assessment. And we also wanted to look at how artificial intelligence tools would challenge educators and raise new questions about ethics and justice and fairness. So that was back from 2021, and we're still seeking to answer that question. For us, we're talking about artificial intelligence as computing systems that are able to engage in human-like processes, such as learning, adapting, synthesizing, self-correction, and using data for complex processing tasks. And so we do not take the stand that artificial intelligence is sentient. I know that that's a contested point. And so for the purposes of our project, this is the working definition that we're using. And we're specifically focusing on algorithmic text generating software. So those writing technologies capable of creating original text, either from scratch or with user input. And here the topic of original and originality has become a topic of debate among our research team, and I think among many people in the world. We started our project with this question. So what are the ethical implications of artificial intelligence technologies for teaching, learning, and assessment? We left it pretty broad. For the instrument that we're using, our colleagues at Brock University developed a survey for use in their faculty of education there. And it was a modified Turing test. So they had writing samples written by GPT-2 and writing samples written by a human. They administered that survey on their campus. I think it was 2021. And just shy of 300 responses, so not quite enough to psychometrically validate their instrument, but nevertheless, let us know through a pilot study that with their survey, just over 62% of their respondents failed in terms of being able to correctly identify which text was written by an AI writing tool, so GPT-2, and which text was written by a human. That really piqued our interest. So with their permission and collaboration, we expanded their survey beyond faculty of education. So that's where their writing samples were focused. And we had general writing samples that could be applied across disciplines. And if people self-identify as being from a STEM discipline, they should get a writing sample that's more specific to STEM. Our survey is currently underway. If you're kind of curious and you'd like to see if you are better at correctly identifying text written by a computer, then you're welcome to take our survey. So our little tagline is, can you identify text written by a robot versus a human? And I know that the whole term of robot is kind of a bit of a misnomer, but it makes for a good pitch when we're trying to collect some data. So you're welcome to take the survey if you wish. And now, our colleagues at Brock University have just received their ethics clearance to administer the survey at their university. So we'll be able to cross-compare data sets at the end from our research-intensive university and their comprehensive university and see what differences, if any, may exist at the end of the whole project, which we're I think, expecting to keep the survey going for a couple of months. And so one of the things I kind of wanted to just situate here is, I don't know what it's like in your circles, but certainly in my circles, that we've been hearing the word ChatGPT used similar to the term Kleenex, and that it's one product from one company, and that there are literally, thank you for sharing the link in the chat, literally now thousands of apps out there. There are directories being updated daily with new apps being added. But we've noticed our colleagues talking about ChatGPT in this very sort of generic sense to refer to all artificial intelligence apps. And although we've tried as part of our educational efforts to kind of correct them, and you say you might be talking about artificial intelligence apps, they'll nevertheless, somehow this term ChatGPT has become already quite persistent. And we're noticing that on our campuses as well. So we're reminding folks, people are saying, this came out of nowhere. We were smacked across the face with this. And showing folks that, well, although, yeah, it's new Google for sure. Although it came on the scene in November of last year, and already now we have GPT-4, GPT-5 is on the horizon. We're just kind of gently reminding folks that this is not actually all that new. So we're taking them back and say, okay, well, ChatGPT is a 3.5, and that means that there were other generations of this technology before this, and kind of them taking them back through this kind of oversimplified timeline, which is not meant to show any disrespect to developers who might see this, because we know that there's tens, hundreds of thousands of hours that goes into developing these technologies, but rather to just let folks who may not have this on their radar know that this technology didn't simply appear out of nowhere. And it's one of the reasons why we were able to submit a grant in 2021, because we could see it on the horizon. And for those folks who are ed tech folks, you will no doubt have had this on your radar as well. And there are also other large language models out there. Yes, so our project to sort of adhere to the replicability of science, if you will, we continue to use GPT-2 for our survey design, but we're also thinking about the next generation of research instruments like ours, where we would collect data using more sophisticated language models. But it was our colleague, Brenda McDermott. You may remember I mentioned her at the beginning. She was our disability advocate who taught our research team that the precursor to all of this actually went back to the 1980s. With what is now today the predictive text that we have on our cell phones being so ubiquitous, having been originally designed back in the mid to late 1980s to help persons with disabilities. And so she keeps reminding us over and over again that there are equity and accessibility issues and questions around this that we should pay attention to, and the ways in which this technology can be used to help persons with disabilities. And she's done some great work. So the next slide was designed by her, so I need to ensure that she's getting credit for that. She talks to us about the benefits for equity, diversity, and inclusion offered by natural language processing technologies as a way to increase accessibility for students, including text summarization, real-time captioning. We may have the real-time captioning here enabled for today's session, and that these tools can provide a multiple ways of engaging for our students, representing knowledge and expressing knowledge. And she's also drawn our attention to the many drawbacks related to equity, diversity, and inclusion, such as the data sets being used with data sets being built with unrepresentative data, resulting in bias and poor user experience. So this has been documented in the literature. We have one reference here, but of course now 2 years later, there's many more articles out there examining social justice issues underpinning the development of some of these tools, and the ways in which natural language processing reproduces biases, not only in language, but also in values and philosophy and society. And not noted on this slide, but also worthy of consideration are the ethical issues around that you may have seen highlighted in places such as Time magazine about the exploitation of offshore labor that has been used, that goes into the development of some of these applications, and by and large how some of that development or the ethical, unethical aspects are largely obscured by some of the companies that develop the technology. So there's still some things we don't know. I've heard a colleague refer to it as a black box in terms of the ways in which the tech is developed. But I think that there is an increasing demand for paying attention to ethics and equity issues in a broad sense around some of this technology. So I promised you at the beginning, we kind of just go back a little bit to sort of where all this started and some considerations for us as educators thinking about going forward and what does all this mean. So when I was writing this book in 2021, last couple of pages, frantically making edits before it's due to the publisher, I was contemplating what does the future of plagiarism look like, and I'm heavily influenced and inspired by the work of Rebecca Moore Howard, who's a compositionist out of New York, and she talks about throwing away the word plagiarism from our policy. She's really really focused on plagiarism as not a moral deficiency in any way, but rather as a skill development issue, and instead it's often a call for help with students and a call for students to have better instruction and better support in terms of their writing development. So there's a whole bunch of complexities behind that I won't go into today, but I was really thinking about Becky's work on this and thinking, okay, so she's proposed, and she's done it for like 20 years, she's retired now, she's proposed that we throw out the term definition of plagiarism, the term, get rid of it in our policies. It's just detrimental to students and their learning, she says. I thought, okay, what does it look like? And I thought, well, reasonably, I don't think if we throw it out, then what? We've got this chasm, this policy chasm, philosophical chasm, pedagogical chasm. What are we left with? We're left with sort of a void, and there was nothing left. And I was like, well, what does it look if we sort of go beyond that? So in the book, I proposed the idea of post-plagiarism in the age of artificial intelligence. And I'll be the first to admit that I didn't develop the ideas very much in the book because the manuscript had to go in. So I planted the ideas in the book, and since then have come to expand on them a little bit and disentangle them. And there's a lot of text on this slide. I'll be the first to admit that. It's a bit of an infographic that I put out in the world. So I'll talk about each of the ideas, and I'd welcome your feedback in the chat here as we're going along. So the first thing I was thinking about in 2021 was this idea of, human AI writing that would become hybrid, and the hybridization of writing would become normal. Sometimes when I talk with colleagues, they talk about the output of large language models as if it's somehow set in stone. I'm like, this is new, like, petroglyph, like it's not fossilized, and letting folks know that no, there are interactive user interfaces where we can go and play with the text, or you can download it and manipulate it and edit it such that in the end, we kind of can't tell what was generated by the AI and what was generated by the human. It's one of the many reasons I think AI text detection tools are flawed. I'll talk about that before we wrap up today. But for now, just kind of thinking of this world where the getting an assist from AI generated tools is the norm. And when I talk with folks now, I tell my colleagues, I'm like, you can safely assume that 100% of your students are playing with ChatGPT or another technology like it now. I was just giving a guest lecture in a class yesterday, and everyone in the class had tried ChatGPT or a similar technology, except the prof. So encouraging my colleagues gently, I'm like, try it for something normal, like creating a grocery list or something like that that's not connected to work, and just try and play with it. And another idea behind that, of course, is that I don't think that human creativity is threatened in any way, but rather that it can be enhanced. And so one of the ideas I've been throwing out to people is, imagine your favorite writer could use a tool like ChatGPT to accelerate and enhance their own creativity. So for fiction fans out there, if you're a Wheel of Time fan, imagine if Robert Jordan could have finished the Wheel of Time series and didn't have to hand it off to Sanderson. If you're a Game of Thrones fan, and a fan, you'll no doubt know that the TV series couldn't keep up with the books. And imagine George R.R. Martin could have used this kind of technology to help them. I don't think there's any empirical evidence to show that human imagination or ability to be creative is in any way threatened by AI. I firmly believe that our ability to be creative and inspire and imagine really continues to remain boundless and inexhaustible. Probably the most contested of these is the idea that language barriers can be overcome. And this is an infographic, so there's not, a whole lot of detail on here. When I wrote this, what I meant was that not that a person's first language would become unimportant. When I said it would matter less, I didn't mean that it would become unimportant, but what I meant was that the barriers would be more easily overcome. This was probably a bit of a romantic idea, influenced in part in being a child who was sat down in front of the TV by my dad to watch the original Star Trek series. So the idea of a universal translator has been with me before I could walk. And so I'm starting to imagine that possibility. If you've seen other technologies such as deepdub.ai and the way that AI is used for voice manipulations and other things, I think that the possibility of a Star Trek universal translator is probably within reach. So just wanted to acknowledge that when I wrote this, I was less attentive than I could have been to the political nature of language translation and interpretation. And in no way was I meant to suggest that certain languages would become less important. On the other side of this infographic is sort of looking at the implications for academic integrity, and ultimately thinking about the ways in which we as humans can relinquish, if we wish, control, or in part or in whole, to these apps to do work on our behalf. And we see this now. This is coming up with some of the questions around student cheating and academic misconduct. And we can say, yeah, okay, app, you can do this writing for me. I'll give you a prompt and you can give me some writing, but in the end, it's the humans that remain responsible for the output. And if you're kind of have your finger on the pulse of what's happening with some of the big scientific publishers, such as Nature, Springer, Wiley, and others, they've declared that AI apps cannot be listed as a co-author on a paper. And there's been a few papers slip through where ChatGPT or other AI language models have been listed as co-authors. There have been a few corrections issued, but the idea behind that is that AI is not yet at a place where it can be held responsible. So it's the scientists and scholars who ultimately publish the article who are held responsible in the case of any misconduct, including fabrication of information, data, references, and so on, so that humans must remain responsible. This is a key thing when we're talking with students in terms of misconduct, because if people ask me, oh, should we change our policy? Should we do this? Should we do that? I'm like, well, there's also already really good things in many university policies. If you have something around data fabrication, falsification, then this is already there. And the attribution continues to remain important. So when I talk about attribution, I'm not talking about the technical aspects of APA. I could care less about the difference between sentence case and title case capitalization. Nevertheless, the ethos of attribution continues to remain important, and giving props, as the young people might say, to those from whom we've learned and those on whose shoulders we stand, continues to be appropriate in all contexts. But then ultimately, for me, historical definitions of plagiarism pretty much no longer apply. And in my world where we study contract cheating and term paper mills, essay mills, there have been pretty strong indications that as an industry, and it is an industry, right, estimated to be somewhere around $14-15 billion, has been sort of collapsing over the past several months as students cut out the middle person to pay that they would have previously paid to do an essay for them, and are going straight to the AI app. So we have new things, cut and paste plagiarism, pretty much a thing of the past. So we're looking for something that's not plagiarism anymore, but we're in a world of post-plagiarism. So I don't have a one sentence definition for you on this, but it is the idea that the cut and paste plagiarism is no longer really something that we're going to have to contend with as much. But there are still concerns, if you will, around artificial intelligence and academic integrity, with one of, I think, the most heated or perplexing right now being around confabulation. I really like this article from Ars Technica by Ben Edwards about why ChatGPT and Bing and all large language models are so good at making things up. Edwards brings forward this notion of confabulation, which he defines as, in being in human psychology, a confabulation occurs when someone's memory has a gap and the brain convincingly fills in the rest without intending to deceive others. That for me was a big crux of it, thinking about misconduct. And he notes that ChatGPT does not work like the human brain, but the term confabulation arguably serves as a metaphor because there's a creative gap-filling principle at work. And also goes on to push back against the term hallucination, but instead brings forward this idea of confabulation. I found this a really useful term when I'm talking with people here, because the tech itself is programmed to give you an answer. It's programmed to fill in the blanks if it doesn't know things. The tech itself, at least to my knowledge, is not programmed to deceive others. And this creative gap filling principle is something that I think you've probably experienced if you've been working with this and you've tried to ask it certain things. So in terms of academic integrity, one of the questions I've put forward is what gap or overlap is there between confabulation, morally neutral action that's based on computer programming, and fabrication, which is often a deliberate act on the part of the researcher or the student to engage in misconduct. As far as I know, there's no such thing as accidental fabrication of data, but confabulation may be what we would call in the academic integrity world accidental or unintentional, even if it is a form of misconduct. Nevertheless, humans are still held responsible for the output of the AI models. But lots of folks will talk to me about these AI text detection tools. I have yet to see empirical studies that have been replicated over time that convince me that these detection tools actually work. I have seen marketing pitches from companies wanting to sell or license you products for their AI detection tools that will tell you that, oh, our tool is 97% effective. What I have seen was a report from OpenAI, the same company that created ChatGPT. They also created a detection tool and then promptly said that it had an effectiveness rate. I think it was about 23%. I think these detection tools are highly problematic, and I have heard of them being used post facto with regards to an assessment. So people sort of literally running to me and saying, my student committed misconduct and I know it. I know they used AI tools for this because I sent it through a detection tool and this is the result I got. I'm like, okay, well, it's probably not going to hold up in a misconduct allegation or report for a couple of reasons. One being we do not support covert assessment or deceptive assessment at our university. We do not use Turnitin or any other text matching software at our university. We do not have an institutional license to any AI generated text detection tools, and I can't imagine that we would be getting one anytime soon. There's a lot of text on this slide again because it's another infographic, but my recommendations to folks who are insisting on using these detection tools is, okay, if you're going to insist on using it, that's your prerogative, but there's probably some ethical principles to think about using as well. One would be to do a policy check and check to see if before you use any of the apps to ensure that their use is permitted by their institution. Probably at this point, very few institutions have a stance on this. I know, for example, University of British Columbia has Turnitin and they have turned off the AI detection feature because they felt it hadn't been adequately tested. So that would be an institutional stance on the use of these tools. If there isn't, Not having an institutional policy stance doesn't give us carte blanche to go ahead and use these. But instead, I tell folks, check with your department head. Say with your department head or whoever the supervisor is, if you don't have a department head, to ensure they've no objections to the use of the tools. If they have objections, I tell folks, don't go rogue. If they have no objections or no opinion, then the next step would be to ensure that the use of such tools is transparently and explicitly declared in the course syllabus, and that you let students know ahead of time what technologies you plan to use as part of your assessment, and that doesn't replace the need for conversations with students, but rather does make it clear in writing how their work will be assessed and using what technologies. And then finally, to have those open conversations with students and let them know not only that the tech will be used, but also what the limitations of the technology are, so that the students are not surprised, they're not taken off guard, not ambushed, but rather that we're being upfront and clear about the assessment. So not a fan of the covert use of these tools to engage in a gotcha approach. I mentioned that at the beginning. But that if we don't have institutions that have guidelines on this, that this can be used as a kind of a checklist or a set of principles for educators to use on before they apply these. And then finally, thinking about the ways in which assessments must be fit for purpose. And there's some different definitions of what that means. For me, it means that assessments should align with course outcomes. You know, we've all got those course outlines or course objectives in our syllabus, right? That's become a pretty standard thing. And if you're anything like many folks at our university, those course outlines are bullet points in the syllabus that are just ignored when it comes to actual assessment design. But nevertheless, the course outlines can then map to the program goals and workforce needs and societal expectations. That third one there around workforce needs makes some people uncomfortable, especially for those folks that have a background in humanities or creative disciplines. It's a little more palatable, I find, in technical programs, STEM programs, those kinds of things. But nevertheless, even if we take out the workforce needs, that program goals would still align some way with societal expectations. So one of the pitches that I make when I talk with folks about assessments being fit for purpose is this. If there is no course outcome in your syllabus that says by the end of this course, students should be able to write their own essay without the assistance of any tools or technologies, then there's no good reason to assign an essay as a learning task for the course. And I can't imagine, I can imagine actually a course in which learning to write without the assistance of any tools or technology could be an assessment. I suppose if you're trying to get a baseline writing sample in a composition course or a technical writing course in order to be able to see student growth, I could buy that argument. But that's a very specific set of courses or set of courses on campus. Very few. And what I'm pushing against here is a historical perpetuation of assignments that may have been appropriate in the 18th century, even the 19th century, and are no longer appropriate today. And looking at those course outcomes, a key thinking of how do we have students demonstrate their learning in our courses? And by and large, not a huge fan of the essay. And given that I have 2 degrees in literature, that's a fairly bold statement coming from someone like me. Be that as it may, I'm not really sure what the purpose of having students write essays is, but I think there's great purpose and promise in having students demonstrate their learning in ways that actually align with what they're supposed to be learning in their courses, in their programs, and what their employers will expect from them when they leave. So that is kind of wraps up my talk for today and the time that I have to spend with you. Thank you for the invitation to join you. I have some references. Rob will get the slide deck. You'll have a copy of that at the end. But now I think we have a little bit of time for some questions. So I welcome your feedback, ideas, and comments.